All right, we are on page 4 technically, but I'm going to back up to page 3 and just give a little summary of aseity and independence, which is the category that we're talking about right now. And so aseity means from himself. And when we say that God is ase, we mean that, and language fails again, we mean that God is from himself. Sometimes you'll see it written like this, that God is self-caused, but that's obviously incorrect. God is not caused. God exists. God is. And so God has life in himself, and he is, and that has a lot of, if you think about it for some time, you will come to a whole bunch of other really important attributes of God that are all linked to this idea of God being ase. So God has aseity, and he has life in himself. And I'll just read John 5:26, which is where we started in this subject, and then we're going to skip ahead after we talk about this briefly. We'll skip ahead in the outline. John 5:26, Jesus is speaking, and he says, "For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself." Now, the Son is speaking of himself as the person of the mediator, and he's saying the person of the mediator has been granted to have life in himself from the Father. The second person of the Trinity, being God, very God, has life in himself always. But here the Father is said to have life in himself. This is an attribute of the Godhead. God has life in himself. And so when we think about everything in our own experience and we think about ourselves, we don't know anything that's got life in itself. What that means to have life in yourself, or what it means for God to have life in himself, is that he doesn't get his life from anything outside of himself. His life is not sustained by anything outside of himself. His life is not derived or dependent upon anything outside of himself. And when we think about ourselves, we realize that we are not like that. We are dependent every second for God to sustain us, and we are dependent upon God for our very existence. The beginning, the middle, the end, all of it. And so we are always dependent on something outside of ourselves. And God is never dependent on anything outside of himself. And the implications of that are huge. And, I've thought about it for some time, but I think if you thought about it a little bit, you would see that what this means is that God is eternal. Because to have life in yourself means that you didn't begin, you are life. That is your essence is life, to be alive. And so you're eternal. And you also would come to the conclusion that you are completely independent, right? If God doesn't get anything from outside that he needs to begin existing or to sustain his existence, then he's completely independent. And then you would also arrive at, from that, I would hope, you would probably arrive at that God is self-sufficient. God has everything he needs within himself. He doesn't need anything from outside of himself. Again, totally different from me. So God is self-sufficient. God is independent. God has life in himself. He's eternal. You could think about it some more and arrive at, since God has everything he needs for whatever he needs for all time, for all eternity, then God is perfect. You could arrive there. Anyway, as you think about it more, you'll see how all of these various attributes are all interrelated. And that's one of the points I wanted to make last week, was not only is God ase, has life in himself, but that all of the attributes of God, as we talked about earlier in the introduction to to this study, all of the attributes of God can be identified with one another, and in fact are linked in this way. On a creaturely level, we see they're all linked, right? So when you start fiddling, if you're a theologian and you start fiddling with one of these, what ends up is there's a ripple effect throughout all the doctrine of God, and you lose the biblical God. So it's important from that point of view also. So so that's what we kind of started talking about at the end of last week, and I guess before we jump into the page 4, where we had read the first 3 verses, I think, in the outline on page 4 about God's eternality, and we've got a couple more left on that subject. But does anybody have anything you'd like to say or ask or comment on at this point? Okay. I see Mike is still thinking hard there.
No, it's just I mean, I think it's one of those things that you, like we were talking about, you never really can comprehend or come up with a comparison, right? Because everything in our universe is dependent,
right?
And is all of those things that you just described about God, like the opposite is true of everything we know. There's not a comparison you can really make.
Yeah, right. And so, we can speak about, as we talked about, right? We can speak about God by way of analogy, because there's not a absolute, completely no point of contact. That would be equivocation on the language, but there is, God has life and I have life. So there's an analogy there, but the kind of life that God has and the kind of life that I have are different, right? So I was thinking about, so before we go on, I'll share just a bit of I'll share an analogy that has a lot of application, and I read it before, and I heard some people talking about it recently. Watched a lecture about it recently. I'll send out the link to the lecture because it's fascinating, but you have to actually sit down and pay attention, because if you don't, you'll go, what are they talking about? I mean, you miss a sentence, you go, what? But so in the ancient church, in the patristic period, so that would be the church fathers, the patriarchs, patristic. So we're talking about 6th century and before, something like that. All the way up through the Middle Ages, maybe even including the Middle Ages, there was this view of God that is different than what we have as a default position. So the default position in our day is to think of God as something in the universe. Okay, I mean, we might not say it like that. That sounds wrong when you say it like that, but I think that's the way we think about God. He's just a thing in the universe. But in the ancient church, the way they thought about God was that there's God and there's the creation, and there's this huge gap, and they're different. And so there's an analogy that's making its rounds right now. It's not a new analogy, but it is becoming more popular, about how to think about God and his relationship to the universe. And I'll just share it, and you can tell me what you think about it, or you can think about it. So think about God as an author. God is an author. So think about, let's pick a human author. Let's pick maybe J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, right? So Tolkien is sitting in Oxford, and he's writing out The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And he's got Bilbo and Frodo and Saruman and all of the characters and all the things that are happening to them. Now, the Shire and Middle Earth, which is described in The Lord of the Rings, where all of the action takes place, is from, now here you have to use your imagination, from Frodo's point of view, an actual real place. Okay, from the characters in the story, this is an actual real place. But also, Oxford is an actual real place. That's where Tolkien is. He's in Oxford. But how would you relate those places, right? You would go, you can't go, there's a one-to-one correspondence between these two places. They're not in the same order of being, right? They're not in the same order of things, right? So you would say, okay, so Tolkien actually exists in Oxford, and Frodo actually exists in the Shire or in Middle Earth, but the existence is different, and the places, even the idea of place, is different in that analogy. And so when we think about, so I think sometimes in the modern world, when we think about God, we think that the difference between, the where God is and where we are is that God's kind of like in London and we're here. But it's not like that at all. It's like we're in Middle Earth and God's in Oxford. It's kind of like that. And it's very different. It's not, I'm not saying we're characters in the story, but it's an analogy, right? It's an analogous kind of a relationship there. And it makes the point then that God he's different, and the words that are true about us and true about God are even different in their, his existence and my existence. It's true that we both exist, but his existence is qualitatively different. And not just because it's better, but it's just different, right? So I think that kind of that author analogy is helpful there, to kind of, get it in your head and think about Middle Earth, Oxford. It's like they're both places, they're both real, as far as, depending on how you're defining reality. But anyway, I thought that was helpful. So I thought I'd share that with you. It has nothing to do with God's eternality, but it does have to do with how we think about God. You have to recognize that the words that we use about God, even though there is a point of similarity, that there is also this aspect that's very, very different, and that we don't want to bring God down to the creaturely level, right, and make him just a thing in the universe. We don't want to do that.
So if Tolkien is the God figure, then we're characters in his story, and he is so far beyond us. We're not even, Frodo doesn't know Tolkien. He doesn't know why he exists.
Right, unless Tolkien writes it into the story. Frodo doesn't know anything about
so Tolkien. And Frodo doesn't know that he's a character. He's living his life.
Right. And so yeah, you could stretch, I mean, you could continue to add to the analogy, right? You could say that, well, what if Tolkien wrote himself into the story? So Tolkien writes himself into the story, and now he's a character in Middle Earth. And he acts and claims that he's the author of the story, and they kill him. Now it sounds like a story I'm familiar with. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. This sounds very incarnational, And then,
But can the character really kill the author?
Right, can't kill Tolkien because Tolkien. So in the analogy there, Tolkien is still in Oxford, but he's also in Middle Earth.
Because Tolkien can do this.
Yeah. Right, but without doing that, without changing the story or whatnot, you can understand how. Okay, well, we'll address a different question. Here's a question. So Jesus, the book of Hebrews says, is sustaining the universe second by second by his powerful word. When he was doing that, and classic Christian teaching has always said that while Jesus was incarnate and walking around in Galilee, he was sustaining the universe. He was sustaining the universe when he was an infant. He was always sustaining the universe. And so now you think of the analogy of Tolkien, and he makes himself a character. Well, Tolkien has not actually left Oxford, but he's also in Middle Earth. And nothing about him being in Middle Earth changes any of the characteristics of Tolkien in Oxford. He's still the author. He's still sustaining the story, etc. And so you have this kind of helpful to some people, I think, helpful to me. You can look at that and go, well, that's why the second person of the Trinity, he remains divine, and he doesn't give up his divinity. So he's still God sustaining the universe, but he's also takes upon himself a human nature and becomes born, right? Born, but he's still sustaining the universe. He's still God. And so so anyway, I understood that before the analogy, but I thought the analogy is also helpful.
So one other part of that, the idea of Tolkien writing himself into the story and then telling the other characters, like that actually is also a useful kind of thought experiment, whatever you want to call it, to because I've heard sort of objections, like atheistic or agnostic objections, saying that, well, why wouldn't like if there's a God, why wouldn't he just show himself and explain everything to us, right? And
right.
You could say he did, but the implication is like just more clearly and directly, right?
Right.
Well, imagine that you're the author, you're Tolkien, and you write yourself into the story to go appear before the characters to explain that you're the author. Like, how they wouldn't even be able to understand what you were talking about first, and it would actually sound ridiculous to them. They'd be like, what do you mean you're the author of our story? We're not a story, we're a village. And we're like, think of the challenge. How would you do that if you were to write the story, create this world, and then write yourself into it? How would you write yourself as the author, as you are, into that story and explain to these characters who you are? How would you do that?
Yeah.
Because that's what God has to do in order to reveal himself to us. Because of how different he is, he has to find some way to communicate that to us and to reveal himself to us. It's not as straightforward and just, hey, show up and do it as that sort of atheistic objection would, presume.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good observation. So great analogy, I think, useful. I'll send you the interview. Sounds fascinating. I mean, this was like a 45-minute interview and explored it quite at depth. Really good stuff. So returning to the outline, page 4, we're talking about God's, the characteristics that I mentioned earlier that you can deduce logically from self-existence, and that are also told us about God in the Bible. And the first one was God is eternal. And we had already looked at Psalm and 1 Timothy 1, but I think we want to look at 1 Timothy 6:16 at this point. So 1 Timothy, man, that's a long sentence. Where does this even start?
13.
Yeah, 13. Go ahead, Becky. Start at 13.
Start at 13. Okay. In the sight of God, who gives life to everything, and of Jesus Christ, who, while testifying before Pontius Pilate, made the good confession, I charge you to keep this command without spot or blame until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which God will bring about in his own time. God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone is immortal and who lives in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see. To him be honor and might forever. Amen.
Amen. So a lot of things are said about God there, right? He alone has immortality. That means he's not subject to death. He dwells in unapproachable light. Which means that we, as we've talked about, we see as he's revealed himself, but not him in his self, in his essence. And it goes on to say that whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. We know he's eternal. He's going to have eternal dominion, or he has eternal dominion. So this passage is really piles on some of the attributes of God here that are important. But I wanted to include it under the eternal. And that's brought up in just a couple of the ideas there. Immortality would imply eternal, can't die. God has life in himself and he can't die. So he's eternal. And then, so if we go look at the next passage, which is Romans 1:23. Talking about people who have suppressed the revelation of God. God has revealed to them, to all people, who he is and that he exists, and he's revealed his eternal nature and his divine attributes to them, and they have in their sin suppressed it. And verse 22 says, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So again, God, the immortal God, God who is not subject to death, and we already know he's the God who is life itself. So one of the, as I said, one of the logical, can't think of the right, I guess what I have written there is it's an idea associated with aseity is eternality, and God is eternal. God is also self-sufficient or all-sufficient. And let's look at Genesis 17:1. Got that, Don?
Yeah. Genesis 17:1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk in my presence and be pure-hearted.
Thanks. So I know, some of us have done studies on various names of God. This is El Shaddai. Here I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. And some translations, some of the English translations have translated this, I am God all-sufficient, or I am God the all-sufficient one. And a lot of your Bibles will actually have footnotes that will say, this is El Shaddai, it means all-sufficient or self-sufficient. And the point of God revealing himself here to Abraham and using this name is he's saying to Abraham, I'm everything that you need, and everything I promise I am able to bring about, because I'm all sufficient. I have everything that I need or you need. And so God is, one of the names of God actually is self-sufficient and all-sufficient. That's what this passage is. Go to Acts 17:24 and 25. This has got to be one of my favorite passages. It's just funny to me. There's a lot of things in the Bible that you read and you go, wow, that just sounded like under my breath or sarcastic or as an aside. And there's a line in here that's like that. Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it. So Paul is speaking to the philosophers on Mars Hill. And they've asked him to come and speak to them because they thought he was talking about two gods, Jesus and the resurrection, two gods. And they wanted him to clarify, what is he talking about? And so he's talking about now the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands. Here's the aside, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So we have the idea here that God is the one who has always existed, and he's the one who gives us life and everything that we need. So all sufficiency there. But the little aside there, as though he needed anything, is a statement of the comprehensive independence of God, the absolute self-sufficiency and independence of God. Doesn't need anything. And maybe I think probably we've all heard the theory floated around that God created the world because he needed, love from people or something like that. I've heard that. That is just blasphemous. That is just, God doesn't need love. God doesn't need anything from me, as if he needed anything. God doesn't need anything. And this just makes it so more glorious when you think God doesn't need me, but yet he created me and gave me salvation and gives me life and is sanctifying me by his spirit. So I, who need him for everything, although he needs me for nothing, so that I can be with him forever.
When I hear that, I go, so if God is perfect and he needs love, why did he make me? Because I am so insufficient to fill a need for God's love. I'm so insufficient. He could have done so much better if he needed something to love him.
Yeah. So I like that answer, because that then also says that when a person postulates that God needed love and then created us, that he's also lacking in wisdom.
Exactly. Exactly. He could have done so much better.
Yeah.
I am the shard of clay on the potter's floor.
Yeah.
He needs me not
Yes.
to fulfill a love deed.
That's right.
I need him.
Yeah.
But he could have done so much better. So that just blows that postulation out of the water.
Yeah. And you hear things like that, even in, usually it's not well-respected theologians, but every once in a while you hear a well-respected theologian say something like that. I was reading a very well-respected theologian who, in this very popular book, said, the whole book was fantastic except for one paragraph. So I just took a marker and colored it black. So now I have a perfect copy of this book. But in the paragraph, he said, God isn't going to be happy until you're glorified. And he didn't mean it in a way like it's a idiomatic saying, right? I'm not going to be happy until XYZ happens. What he meant was, God's unhappy right now, and he won't be happy until he glorifies you. There's like no way is God's happiness dependent on me. There's absolutely no way that's true. God was completely happy before he created the world.
Well, you go back to the analogy and I say, God is complete. Although it feels incomplete to say that, it just seems too simple.
Yeah.
But God is complete. He needs nothing. He is lacking nothing. We contribute nothing to his completeness.
Right. And we don't the shocking thing to a lot of people is that he doesn't need us to tell him how to run the world.
Oh no.
Yay. One of the small gratitudes. Yay.
Yeah, so thankfully God, who knows what he's doing, is running the world, right? He hasn't left it to us. That would be way bad. So anyway, this verse where it says as though he needed anything, I think that's.
But then again, I think as Christians, he don't need us in one sense of the word. I agree, but in another sense, he needs us for the work we could do for him on earth to carry out his purpose, will, and plan until he comes again.
Right. In the context of God's eternal decree, everything that is so right in the two contexts, right? So in the context of God's decree, God has decreed that we will do certain things, and so those things are necessary in that sense in the context of the decree. But for God deciding to do that and doing anything that he does, not necessary at all. But yeah.
No.
So we make a distinction there between God is as he is in himself and as he has decreed to bring about his perfect plan in the world. Of course,
Yeah, okay.
But it's a perfect plan for us.
Yeah.
If he wiped out Earth and the third rock from the sun never existed, isn't he still complete?
right, he doesn't lose anything.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
So it's still for us,
right.
not for
Right.
him.
Yeah, it's not for him. He's not changed in his essential character by our existence or non-existence. Nothing changes.
Yeah.
He's
If,
absolutely
if he has plans for me and theoretically I get taken out early, tsunami comes and I'm gone, I'm not that important to his plan that his plan won't be completed.
right.
Mhm.
God will always accomplish what he's meant to accomplish. Yeah. So let's move on to the next passage, which is Romans 11:33-36, which is a passage I think would really, really needs, half an hour, maybe 2 hours to really work through. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen.
And
So we're talking about self-sufficiency, but there's a lot of other things that come up here. But God is incomprehensible, right? He's unsearchable in his judgments and inscrutable in his ways. So he's incomprehensible. We can't say everything there is to say about him, and we can't even know anything except what he's revealed. And he hasn't revealed everything. He's only revealed what we need to know for our salvation, that we might obey him and worship him rightly. And then verse 34, who has known the mind of the Lord? Well, nobody, except the three persons of the Trinity. Nobody knows the mind of the Lord. Who has been his counselor? Nobody. Does he need a counselor? No. Who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? Nobody. God owes nobody. God owes nothing to anybody except what he has promised, right? But he doesn't have to make that promise. For from him and through him and to him are all things. So from him is life, and through him is life. We are sustained. So we get life from God, and God sustains us. So through him and to him are all things. And God has created us for himself. That's what it means. To him are all things. And this is why to him be the glory forever. Amen. So we exist at his pleasure and for his pleasure. And he will bring about his good and perfect will through us and in us, and even despite of us or without us. He's going to do it, but he's graciously designed to let his glory be seen by us, that we might know him. And so this verse has so much in it about the purpose of your life, where you need to go to get help, God, right? And about how he's unlike us. He's not like a human potentate, a human king that has to wait for Congress to give them their opinion or something like that. He is all wise and all knowing. That's why nobody has to be his counselor. And He has everything he needs. Nobody's given him a gift. He owes nobody. And everything that we have comes from him and is sustained by him and is for use for his glory. So a great passage, really good passage there. Job 22:3. This goes right along with, has anybody given him a gift? You know, that he has to repay them? So this is one of Job's friends speaking to Job, and occasionally Job's friends say some things that are true and useful, and this is one of those occasions. And you know, when I read Job and I read Job's friends, I think, well, their percentage of saying true and useful things is pretty darn low. And then I wonder what my percentage is. Hopefully it's, you know. Job 22:3, is it any pleasure to the Almighty, Job, if you are in the right? I put the word Job in there, but that's who he's talking to. Is it any pleasure to the Almighty if you're in the right? Or is it gain to him if you make your ways blameless? So the friend of Job here is saying to Job, you know, what does God gain from you? Even if you're right, what does God gain from that? Even if you are totally perfect and blameless and sinless in everything you do, does that make God more glorious or increase anything about God? And the answer is no, right? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is nothing, nothing. And then Psalm 50, verse 12. And another great one. God speaking, if I was hungry, I would not tell you. For the world and its fullness are mine. This is basically, so hunger is a basic need, right? Having food is a basic need. God is saying, if I had a basic need, I wouldn't look to you to help me out. But God doesn't have basic needs. God has no needs. And but this says something about God's not having needs, and it also says something about our ability to supply. And God can look over the whole creation and he can go, you know, if I was gonna have to get something to eat, you're probably the last person I'd ask. So our ability to supply anything to God that would make him more godlike, more better, is not possible. And this is because God is perfect and self-sufficient and all-sufficient, which is just another way of saying perfect, right? So I had John 17:23. Where is that? Is that? Oh, somehow I skipped. No. So perfect. So that's the next part on the outline, John 17:23. And I'm not clear. I'm not remembering why I included this passage on the outline, but maybe somebody else can comment. Jesus is speaking. He's praying to the Father. He says he's praying for us. And he says, I and them and you and me, talking to the Father, you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. So I'm not sure why I put that there.
I think that's where they got the line from the song I Am the Walrus.
I am the walrus. Yes. What line was
I am
that?
he, as you are me, and we are all together.
Okay. Yeah, it might be.
What about Goo Goo Kachu? Doesn't that?
So sorry about that.
It's all good.
We'll go to maybe what's next? Deuteronomy 32:4. And this one says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Lots of attributes there. What God does is perfect, perfect work. So this, even though it just says that his work is perfect, I think the implication is that God is perfect, not just his work. And the implication you can get there because if you're thinking about what is a perfect work, so for a work on, at least on a human level, on a creaturely level, for a work to be perfect, it has to be done. Not only is it a work that completes and fulfills the intention of the person doing the work, but the person doing the work is doing it for the right reason, with the right motivation, and for the right purpose. And so that person has perfect, we would say perfect, intentions. And so you can extrapolate that back. But God, his work is perfect, but a perfect work comes from a perfect being. So then let's look at, I think the next passage in 2 Samuel might say the same thing. True, it's almost the same. 2 Samuel 22:31. This God, his way is perfect. So the way God does stuff, the way God thinks, the way God lives, the way God acts, it's perfect. God is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. So God is perfect there. And then
my translation there too had not only as for God, his way is perfect, but the Lord's word is flawless. So a synonym for perfect.
right. Yeah, good. And that's, which translation
And
is that?
that's NIV.
NIV, okay. So Psalm 18:30 says the same thing. It's just a quotation, or a 2 Samuel 22 appears again in the Bible as Psalm 18. There's slight differences, but it's both, they're introduced the same way. It's from David about God who delivered him from all his enemies, including Saul. So that's why you see it twice. So Psalm 18:30, we'll skip over that, go to Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So God's will is perfect. And then James 1:17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So again, this one says everything that God gives is perfect. Everything that God does, all of his ways, all of his will, is perfect. God is perfect. This passage in James will come up again when we're talking about unchangeableness. God is immutable. That's the word, immutable. To be mutable is to be able to mutate or to be mutated. To be mutable is to be able to be changed. But God is immutable. He's unchanging and also unchangeable. And this verse says that when it says, calling God the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And so this also has the idea of being perfect, right? Unchangeable and unchanging. I think we talked briefly, or I mentioned briefly last week, I think, might have been the week before, about the difference. Now we're going to have to go back and do a philosophical category for a second here, but I think I talked about actuality and potentiality. Does anybody remember that? I think I said God has no potential. Somebody should remember I said that. Yeah. We have potential, right? I can be worse than I am or better than I am. And that's because I am mutable. I can change. I'm mutable. But God is immutable. He cannot change. He cannot get better, and he can't get worse. So he has no potential. And in philosophy, so philosophically speaking, they would say he has no potential. He is all actual. God is pure act, is what they would say. So nothing. So what this means when James says that God is the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change, is he's saying God is unchanging. God isn't going to change the way he is tomorrow. He's always going to be the same. He always has been the same. God is. That's the significance, I think, of the divine name in Exodus 3:14. I am that I am. God is. He's the same. He's unchanging. He's the self-existent one. So we're still basically talking about things that you can get to easily from the idea of aseity. And these are all things that are attributed to God in the Bible. The next one is self-determined, and we'll go back to Romans 11:36 for this, 11:33 to 36. So we'll just read 36. For from him and through him and to him are all things, to him be glory forever. Amen. God is self-determined. Everything that we have, everything that is in existence, everything that has happened and will happen is from God. There's nothing in God that is from outside of himself, but everything that we experience is from outside of us. And so God is self-determined. This is also the point in verse 34, who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor. Nobody's advised God, and then God determined what he would do. He's self-determined. So this is a characteristic of God that we'll run up against it again when we talk about omniscience. God knows all things. He knows all things necessarily, and he's all wise. And so God does always the wisest thing with all the things that he knows, which is not like us again. But because God is all knowing and all wise, he doesn't need a counselor to decide what to do. Doesn't need any input from anybody. And so this is what we mean when we say self-determined. We say he is who God is of himself, not from, he's not derivative or has contributions from anything outside of himself.
Amen.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if anybody else feels like this. I feel like my brain is just absolutely being stretched way beyond its ability to comprehend. And it reminds me of what Mike said at the beginning there. We have nothing to compare this to. It's hard for us to conceive of God being all sufficient and perfect and all these other things, because we don't know anybody like that. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of the analogy you gave with the, Tolkien and Middle Earth and Frodo and Bilbo. They would have no way to even conceive of what life is like at Oxford, because there's nothing like that in Middle Earth.
Right.
And the only way you know is what the author tells you. That's all you know. And even then, it's hard to imagine.
Right. And it's hard to imagine for two reasons, right? One is, as has been said, there's nothing in our experience, but what we try to do is take creaturely categories, force we take the points of analogy, but we try to stretch them into creaturely explanation. And so then we lose what's being said. And, we also have the great difficulty because, well, there's the purpose of the revelation, right? The purpose of the revelation isn't so that I can draw or, write out and say, this is God, I've completely defined him, or I've defined him in so much as he's revealed himself. The purpose of God revealing himself is so that we may see his glory and worship him. That is the purpose. So we can worship God this way. We can say, God, I know you're self-sufficient. I have nothing in my experience that is like that, but I know myself and I'm not self-sufficient. And man, you must be so awesome. So we can worship God like that, right? We can take these things that God says about himself and say, you are just greater than I can conceive. I can worship you for what I understand, which is very small and nowhere near the completeness of even your revelation. But what I get from studying your revelation is that you are greater than I can imagine. And wow, what a God. I mean, this, so there was, what did Anselm call God? It was, let's see.
While you look that up, it's hard to even imagine something that you can't imagine.
Yeah.
Is
So-
there such a thing as something I can't imagine?
So here's Anselm's definition. And Anselm wrote he wrote several books, but this is from a book called the Proslogion. I don't know what that means, something about words, first words, but he's praying to God, he's talking to God, and he has this characterization, the way he talks about God, he returns to it over and over and over. This is like foundational to his thinking. He says, God is that being than which no greater can be conceived. If you can conceive of something, God's greater than that. There is no being greater than God. God is a being than which no greater can be conceived. And so he's always returning to that thought, and he's talking about how his puny mind can't grasp everything about God, but what he knows is that God is so much, almost infinitely greater than he can imagine, and so that God can meet any need in any way, and he can't anticipate it, he can't imagine it, and God will do things in the world that God will be glorified in, that think about it, right? Would we have thought that the worst thing in history, right? The crucifixion of Christ. Absolutely. God writes himself into the story. He comes into the story and he gets crucified. That's got to be the worst thing that's ever happened. And
As
yet,
well as the best.
as well as the best, right? We would not have done it like that. We could not even imagine that could have been the plot twist. And we would just go, no way, something's out of control here. This is totally wrong, right? But God,
We got it wrong. That must not have been him,
yeah, it must not have been him.
because he
Wow.
died.
Yeah, I thought it was going to end the way I would have written that story, but it ended differently. So I gotta be wrong about my guess. But God does things that are inconceivable. Great, he's greater than I can conceive. And so it's so he does this, and so that is so comforting, right? When things look out of control, and when you're need comfort, you just look at who is God. Well, he's completely awesome. He's more awesome than I can even conceive. And which is to say, our human definitions of all these words we've been talking about are insufficient to express adequately, or to express fully. We can express adequately for the purposes of worship, but we can't express fully for the purposes of description. So we look at all of these things, and if we're doing it, as an intellectual thing, then it's a problem. But if we're looking at it like wow, God is way greater than I thought. Yeah.
He's
JB Phillips.
way greater than I will ever think.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
I'm a product of his imagination.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. It's true.
I know. Wow.
Yeah. Everything you are comes from him and is in him, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, but it's not the other way around, right? He is so much bigger and better and greater than I can imagine. There was a really famous book in the 1960s. You may have heard of it, by a guy named JB Phillips. He wrote, the title of the book was Your God is Too Small. And he was addressing it to the evangelical church. He was a pastor, and he was saying, our God in our mind is too small, you know, because God is way bigger than what you're thinking. And I think we fall into that trap, right? We try to bring God down to creaturely dimensions. We make him a thing in the universe, but he's not. He's not a thing in the universe. He's the creator of all things. He is like that author in Oxford, and I'm in Middle Earth. It's like that. He's very.
He is the universe.
Yeah, he is. The universe exists in him, but he's not a thing in it. There was something I read today from one of the other early church fathers, and he was talking about the tendency of people to say God is in this place, God is in that place, like God is in the universe, for instance. And while it's true that God is immanent, meaning not that he's going to be happening any moment, but immanent meaning he's near, and he is in every place that we know. That's the church father was objecting to the idea of God being in a place.
As in contained by.
Right, as
Confined, yeah.
water is in the cup, right? He was saying, no, every place is present to God. Every place is present to God. God is in no place. That's what he said. God is in no place, meaning that God can't be confined. I heard another quote from a Puritan. This one I really love. Thomas Watson was writing about God's omnipresence, which means he's present everywhere, or everything is present to him, depending on which way you look at it. He said, God's center is everywhere, but his circumference is nowhere. That's an awesome quote. God is fully present everywhere.
It has no circumference.
Has no circumference.
Mhm.
Wherever God is, he's there fully. But you can't say that God is everywhere. And God is bigger than the everywhere that we know. So really, like Paul said, we live and move and have our being in him. In him. It's not the other way around. He's not a thing in the universe. The universe is actually, in him, using that way of speaking. So that's those are just really just mind stretching thoughts.
Yeah, it's I would say impossible for us to truly fathom even just a little bit. We scrape the edge and go, ow, that hurts. Because if I'm created in the image of God, then I have to think, an imagination is, comes from the word image. And so if I'm an image made in the image, it makes me think of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, to the point that it gets so pixelated and distorted, it doesn't actually really resemble the clear crispness of the original.
Mhm.
And and that's where my heritage would come from, because I'm a copy of a copy of a copy of my ancestors. But yet we're all created in God's image. So now I've come to that catch-22, and my mind hurts.
Yeah. So we're on on the outline. I'm on the next not major section, but the next minor section under the category of aseity, page 4. Are you guys feeling okay to continue, or you want to stop here tonight?
Yeah, I need to check out.
Okay.
We hurt Gary.
We heard
Oh,
Gary.
I've got my head swimming.
And we hurt Don.
Goodbye, all. Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye,
Don.
Don.
Yeah. So, no, it's great to really sit down and have some dedicated time to think about God's revelation of himself, and to really think about, since this is true, then this is true, and this is true. And then to see that these things are all not only related, but they're all biblically supported, and that God is truly way greater. It's like the book of Hebrews, right? What's the theme of the book of Hebrews? Jesus is greater. Jesus is better. It's always true of God. He's way greater. Jesus is always better and greater than what you imagine.
Well,
Yeah.
it's what we read in Romans, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we see the little bit of the, it's kind of almost the tip of the iceberg type thing. We see a little bit of, what God has revealed. We see that. And when we see that, we know, well, God says, but we also know that's not everything. And that indicates a massive, incomprehensible thing that is without bounds. I mean, it's so, that's what incomprehensible means, right? It's no bounds.
Can't comprehend it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the purpose of the revelation, is worship. And the reason we want to spend time, talking about God as he's revealed himself is because he's revealed himself to us. And these are important things he said about himself, and they help us with knowing him and help us with worshiping him. And so the more time we spend thinking about this, the better it is actually for us, because we know God a little bit better. And it also helps us in our conversation, because sometimes we slip into that. I think the most common mode that we slip into is God is a thing in the universe mode, and God's like me type of mode. And we tend to think of God as just greater than me. He's like me, but greater. But God is inconceivably greater. He's not just better at things than I am. He's so inconceivably greater.
I think in a lot of these things, if you sort of take them at a surface level, it's like they seem in one way sort of simple and like, yeah, I know that, like, okay, because we've heard it before, like, okay, God is eternal, God is perfect, all of these different things, where we're so used to hearing that we almost like think like we get it, like, yeah, I get it, right? But then, as like you were saying, it's important to review these things and to sort of dig into them and really try to comprehend what it really means, is when you realize, well, just this sort of shorthand understanding I have that God is perfect, or that God is eternal, you're really not, even though it's impossible to comprehend it, like, you don't really understand how incomprehensible it is until you try to move it forward and realize that you don't really understand the implication or the impact or the depth of these characteristics that you think that we have these easy words to attach to. I guess one way I think of that is like in terms of like, so omniscience, or you think of truth, right? Like God knows all truth, right? And we know what truth is, but God doesn't just know all truth, like God created truth. So that's where you realize that it's not just like there's a collection of facts and God knows them all and I only know some of them. It's that without God, truth like didn't exist. And so, that's hard for us to, I guess, understand, but it's again, it gets you to realize, well, it's not just like you were saying, he's not just the smartest man in the room. He's the one that created the possibility and the entire mind, the ability to have a mind and to apprehend truth and to recognize it, and like all that was created by God. So I mean, I think that helps you get a little bit above to where you realize how deep in the water you are. It's not just that you're a few facts short of God. It's that God created truth and then gave us the ability to perceive truth.
Yeah. So to relate that to the author analogy, right? God's omniscience. We'll relate that to the author analogy. So Tolkien, he knows everything about Middle Earth. Right? There's nothing in Middle Earth that Tolkien is unaware of. How does he know it? Because he read the books? No, he knows it because he wrote the books, right? And so he knows all the facts, and he knows all the right relations to one another, and he knows the significance of every single one of them. And even the ones that we're reading the book and we go, why did that happen? Later on, it's all resolved. He already knows that, because he's the author. He created those facts. And so, but God is exactly the same, right? He creates everything. And so he knows everything. He knows, I mean, not so in the, he did this and that caused that, but as a related to the fact that he creates everything is also he knows everything. And it's necessarily related. It's not, and this also helps you with foreknowledge. How does Tolkien know? I mean, Tolkien can pick up the Lord of the Rings. He can flip 15 pages ahead and see what Frodo's going to do. But it's not in the future to Tolkien, right? It's in the present to Tolkien. And so, because Tolkien's got the whole thing laid out.
It also helps you understand a little bit like the difference, like how, like we say God's plan, right? How that's operating on such a different level. Because if, you were to ask the author, well, why is some aspect about the story about why something is the way it is, like, why is that house there in the village? There could be some plot element that required that a certain thing to be a certain way. And that's why it's there, is because Tolkien had some part of the story that required an element be a certain way in order for some other part of the story to have, to happen. But if you were to ask somebody in that world, like, why is this house here? It's well, because, there was this something, they would have a completely different way of understanding why those things are. And so this idea of Tolkien's plan, God's plan, Tolkien's plan, you understand that there's things that we, the characters in the story can't understand. Wait a minute, what? That house is there because it had to be in order for our story to make, to go a certain way. Like,
Good point.
It's just a different level of how those plans, how God's plans look to God versus how we try to understand them.
Right. So I think I'll say something here about eternal and eternality, because I think in our minds, we might not have the same working definition. And there's been several types of definitions offered in history. I think the most popular one in our generation probably is something like unending time, something like that. And the difficulty with that in the past has been that it's got the word time in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're bringing the word time in, right? So you have the concept of time, which is, it's a created thing. Time exists for us, right? We exist moment by moment. God does not. God exists necessarily, eternally. So his, we say sometimes God's time is not our time. God doesn't have time, okay? Time is a sequence of events, right? A sequence of events, and events are only known from each other because they change. Things change, but God in His being does not change, right? So we have no time there, no time. So
outside of time as opposed
Yeah.
to inside of time, right?
right. So sometimes we talk about God as existing before the creation, and I know what we understand
Mm,
about that, but it might be more helpful to think of God as existing outside of the creation.
mm,
Okay. I mean, before is right. I mean, according to our time, right?
Mm.
According to that, but technically there's no before if there's no time. So if we're talking about God in eternity,
Yeah.
there's no time, there's no before.
Okay, now my head really hurts.
So
We're creatures of time because that's the way he created our world and our existence. But
right.
he has no
Mhm.
beginning because
Right.
there's no time, and he has no end because there's no time.
Mhm.
Right, and he has no
And
concept-
but for us to comprehend things outside of time, I can't do that.
Mm-mm.
I know it's true, but I can't comprehend that because I'm a creature of time.
So I think what we do is we get back to God is life in Himself, and we say that eternity is unending life, life without beginning, life without end, eternity, and
Mhm.
that God has eternity is not something that God exists in, because God's not in a place or in a thing, but God is eternal. He has unending life, and
Mhm.
so I think that's helpful, and I think the author analogy might be helpful here too. It's because in the Tolkien Middle Earth analogy, so Frodo and Sam are on their way to Mordor to destroy the ring, right? And then Tolkien's writing the pages, and he gets up to go to the bathroom, right? So I'm telling you basically the whole interview here, but you can still watch it. He gets up to go to the bathroom, and he's gone for 10 minutes, right? But in Middle Earth, that's totally, Frodo and Sam are completely unaffected by that. Tolkien comes back, finishes the story, right? Now, so what that illustrates is time in Oxford and time in Middle Earth are completely different. They're not related.
Chuck, where did you say this analogy came from?
So this is from, so C.S. Lewis uses it.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that's where it sounds familiar with something I'd heard from C.S. Lewis.
Right. So Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, and then a bunch of modern theologians. And I'm pretty sure some patristic theologians also used it, but I don't know
Okay, yeah,
haven't done it. It's been around for a while.
yeah.
And it makes sense because author and creator are very analogous, right? Obviously, because the author is creating another, like in the case of Tolkien, he creates an entire universe, right? Populates it and gives it a whole history. And this is very much like a creator. In fact, he's just creating on paper. So that's why the analogy, I think, seems to work really well when we're talking about God. And the reason that it's helpful, I think, is because when we think of creator, we're not comparing that to anything except for human creators. But and so they're all in the same class and category as us. But when I take an author who wrote a fictional work, and then you say, well, we're kind of like that, those people in Middle Earth, and God's like kind of like Tolkien out there in Oxford, you get it. You get that there's different realms. And so the same words that we use of us, they're not exactly applied the same way when we talk about God. So eternality, it's not unending time. It is unending duration, unending life. I think that's a little more helpful. We get ourselves confused about time and eternity. We say, well, eternity is just longer than time because it's got more days, but it's not like that. Eternity is actually, it's another one of the characteristics of God himself, of having life in himself. This means he has unending duration, unending life. So he exists eternally. And so in a glorified state, we will exist with him in eternity. And what that will look like, we don't know. It's still incomprehensible, but it isn't. We try to go, well, on Tuesday, we'll, get our harps, and on Wednesday, we'll get our robes. And I'm not sure it's going to be like that. Pretty sure it's not going to be like that.
I hope we get our robes before our harps.
Yeah. Right. We tend to think of eternity as time.
That brings me back to something else, actually sort of obliquely brings me back, because I've just been, you know how I am. I've been thinking about this for the last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You said you were making a statement that some people say, well, God is just like me, only greater. Well, that is an extremely self-centered view of the world. And it makes a lot more sense to say, I am like God, only lesser. Much less.
Much lesser.
I'm made in his image, but
Yeah.
he isn't like me. I'm in some ways like him.
That's right. And actually some patristic, church fathers said exactly that.
Oh, well, what do you know?
He's not like us, but we are like him. And of course, the value of thinking like that is to say you don't start with a creation and work backwards.
Right. And you don't start with yourself as the center.
Right. You go to God's revelation, and the reason that we know that we're like him is because he uses analogical language to speak about himself. And that means there's a point of similarity. And he also says we're created in his image. And so that implies, of course, some kind of similarity there.
But we don't know what that image is. We can't see it. If we go back to Tolkien, man, of course, is in his image pretty closely, but hobbits they're bipedal. They have 2 eyes, 1 nose, a mouth, 2 arms, 10 fingers. They're just furry.
Yeah.
But you can see a similarity. Almost all of the sentient beings in to borrow from Star Trek are in that kind of a form.
Yeah. Humanoid.
And so, is the image of a hobbit like Tolkien?
Yeah. The Hobbit wouldn't know unless Tolkien told him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah,
Tolkien more like Gandalf? I don't know.
Yeah. So, yeah. And so then, with the image of God in the Bible, we do have a little bit more information than Frodo would have, right? We do know that the physical form of humanity, bipedal and all of that, is not what God is talking about when he says the image, because God is both invisible and without dimension. So he is you can't confine him to a body. And we also know the Bible says that that Christ is the image of God, and God himself, but the image of God, and we're being transformed into the image of Christ. And that, I think it's in Ephesians 4 or 5, it says that we're being transformed in the image in true righteousness and holiness. And so we can go there, and a couple other places in the New Testament where it defines the image of God as moral and spiritual characteristics. So we reflect God's character when we behave righteously. We reflect his character, and that's the image of God. So we do know something. We do know something about that. And this also contributes to our understanding of God's spiritual nature, right? He is spirit. And so that necessarily means without body. And
But it's so easy to get sucked into what we know when we put up some kind of frameworks as we try to understand.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
we live in a physical world. And so that's where we go. Is the
Yes.
physicality of things.
Right. And so we need to guard ourselves against things like that, thinking improperly.
But if we're willing, God is constantly transforming our minds too, to where we can think more spiritually too, as
That's
we
true.
go along.
That's true. Romans 12 talks
But
about.
we got to be willing to allow that to happen. We could block that too.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So Romans 12:2 says that we're being transformed, or that we will be transformed in our minds. So this is another immaterial aspect. It's not brains, but minds, which is usually equated to personality. You know, we kind of divide it up and say it's the thinking center, but it's really the personality. Yeah. So I think what is it? It's like 8:28. Look at that. So we kind of took a break from the mind stretching stuff for the last 20 minutes. So the stuff we've been talking about the last 20 minutes should have been like really easy. But
Comparatively.
Yeah, relatively easy. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll pick up on page 4 in the middle of the page next week. I feel really blessed that you guys wanted to go through this and that you are working through it and contributing and enjoying it. It's
This is great, Chuck.
yeah, it's a great subject.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great subject. So
I think everybody should try to go through something like this. Just, like Jane said, her mind is so stretched beyond, it'll snap back, but it's kind of like a rubber band. It'll never be quite the same shape again.
We're here for you, Jane. We're here for you.
Are you implying that I'm unraveling?
No.
I think she is.
I'm implying that your mind is stretchy.
Yeah.
Stretching's good. Unraveling.
yeah. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.